Present tense is what we did in Spanish 1. Last chapter we did preterite. The reason why we're kind of going back and forth is because present tense we should be solid on at this point. That's Spanish 1 stuff that we've already gone over. So just to refresh our endings, o, as, a, amos, an, and o, es, e, hemos, imos, and en. So it's a different ending for the nosotros form for present tense verbs. The reason why we mentioned preterite last chapter is because we're going to also see what happens with the same set of verbs in this chapter. We're going to see what happens with them in the preterite tense. Okay? So keep in mind what we talked about last chapter with preterite tense. Obviously the endings are different. And so, e, o, amos, aron. And you have very clear accents. Anything to do with regular verbs on the yo form, the el, ello, usted form. And then you have to watch out for your cargados adverbs. That's all counted as part of your regular verbs because you're looking for that pattern. Verbs that end in car, gr, zr. And you notice that those all have accents on those e's, and the ending that has an e is the one for ar verbs. So you know that you only do that in the yo form. What I want to make sure that we're clear on, and that's why this last preterite test was worth a lot of points, to make sure that we're clear on preterite, we're clear on present, and then we're going to focus majority of our time in this chapter in the present tense. So we're going back to focus on these endings, but we are going to do, there's always a bigger section of vocab for each chapter than a smaller section. The bigger section will be doing these verbs in the present tense. We'll also see what happens with these verbs in the preterite or past tense. So you'll have to know both by the end of 2 weeks. So just wanted to bring back our endings. Also wanted to mention that our first chapter that we covered with reflexive verbs. The only thing different about reflexive verbs is what? Okay, the endings depend if you want to do it in the present or preterite. You did have some stem change, which is exactly what we're going to talk about today. But what extra did you need for reflexive verbs?
Pronoun.
The pronoun. What were your reflexive pronouns? Me, te, se, nos, and se. Okay. So if a verb happens to end in an se, that's how you know that's a reflexive verb. Then you need your me, te, se, nos, and se. We happen to do them, those are your pronouns right there, we happen to do them in the present tense. If you wanted to do those verbs in the preterite tense, all you would do is you still add your me, te, se, nos, and se in front of the verb if it's one verb, at the end of the verb if it's two verbs, and you would just change your endings. So instead of I wake up, I woke up, woke myself up. That reflexive part still stays there. Okay? So no big deal. I just want you to start taking notice that verbs that we've done in Spanish 1, we can use in present or preterite. Verbs that we did in the reflexive, even though we just focused on present tense, you can also do them in the preterite. So now you have a lot more flexibility to do with these verbs. Now, in Spanish 1, and with some of our reflexives, we talked about some verbs that were stem changers. Grammar books call them stem changers. Your book is a very interesting book, but it calls them radical change verbs. I don't think it's that radical, but I call them boot verbs because that's what helps you remember where the change takes place. Doesn't matter what you call them as long as you know what happens to them. In Spanish 1, we did tener. Anybody remember conjugations of tener? What was the yo form?
Tengo.
Tengo. So it was that go change. Then the rest was tienes, tiene, tenemos, tienen. There was an IE change inside the little shoe. So we're going to talk about the difference between shoe and boot verbs. Different teachers call them different things. So it just depends on your preference. Querer was the same thing. That E changed to IE. Quiero, quieres, quiere. Queremos, no change. That's why we call it a boot. The nosotros form doesn't get a change. And then quieren. Jugar was a weird little bird because it doesn't really fit a family of stem changing verbs. Normally you have 3 types, O to UE, E to IE, and E to I. Jugar happens to be thrown in with the O to UE verbs, even though there's no O to change. So it's a U to UE change. That's the only verb you're going to run across. that'll be a little bit odd like that. But do we recognize acostarse and despertarse from our reflexive chapter? Okay. Acostarse was an O to UE change. So in addition to doing your reflexive pronouns, me, te, se, nos, and se, with verbs like acostarse, dormirse, and poder, whether it was reflexive or not, you would still make a UE change inside the boot. So I'm bringing all this up because what we're going to do this chapter is easy if you remember everything that you already know about these. Some of them we've done in Spanish 1, some of them we've done it in the reflexive chapter, and then this chapter we're going to focus on more, not just what we already know, but adding more to those verbs. Despertarse, be careful that whenever you have two E's, you won't always have two E's, like sentarse only has one, divertirse only has one, but despertarse, if you have two E's, the rule always is change the one closest to the AR, E, or IR. So not the actual AR, E, or IR that you're going to take away to conjugate, but whatever's closest to, the stem part of the verb. What's left over once you drop your AR, E, or IR. But stem changing verbs only change in the stem from O to UE, E to IE, and E to I. When we did these changes with the reflexive ones, we focused more on O to UE and E to IE, but we did do vestirse. We had ponerse la ropa or poner la ropa as to dress yourself or to put on clothes. Vestirse was just an extra verb that meant the same thing that happened to be reflexive. It was an E to I change. So we haven't worked with E to I that much. Know that this chapter, when we look at page 40 in your textbook, it really only focuses on E to I verbs, so we're just going to do them all together. And then I'll tell you that, how to tell them apart, basically, how to tell the difference.
Don't you use like the second? There's two E's in a reflexive. Do you use the second one?
Right. Whether it's reflexive or not, you're going to use, if there's an E and an O or an O and an E, you're always going to know if you're going to change the O or the E by knowing which one is closest to the end. And then one final thing before we actually get into this that I want to make sure we're clear on. Anything that we talked about in the present tense that was irregular, that was a go verb, that was completely irregular, that didn't make any sense, didn't follow the rules. That's one set of verbs for present tense. When we switched to preterite, which we did last chapter, you notice that when we did hacer in the present tense, algo is just a go change in the present tense. But when we did hacer in the preterite, it was totally irregular. Hice, hiciste, hice, hizo, hicimos, hicieron. So just know from the beginning that if something is irregular in the present tense, it may or may not be in the preterite. And if it's irregular in the preterite, it's most likely going to be a different kind. Know that different tenses have different rules. That's all I want you to know for now. Okay. The stem changing verbs that we're going to talk about today have a stem change. And we're going to focus in the present tense, so you will see as we do these verbs that not only are we using present tense endings, because we're going to talk about them in the present tense, but make a note on your paper somewhere that we're present tense only is what we're about to talk about. It only applies to present tense. So if I asked you to do dormir in the preterite or past tense, these changes would not apply. I am going to show you later in the week what happens with dormir in the preterite or past tense, but it is not going to be a boot. So know that we're focusing present tense. Everybody okay with that? All right. So if you want to jot down an example of each, you can, but the concept is very similar to what we've already done in Spanish 1 with tener and jugar and different verbs. So what you would do, and again, present tense only. I call them boot verbs. They're called stem changing verbs, whatever you want to call them. Dormir, you would take that U, you change the O, change the O to UE. Always make sure you know the meanings. You will be required to know the meanings of these verbs by next week. So you're getting your chart today. If you want to make cards for these, you can. It's entirely up to you. But the verb dormir changes from O to UE instead of boot. All boot means is that the nosotros forms is out. If it happens to be dormirse, which we did as a reflexive verb, we would just do me duermo, te duermes, se duerme, nos dormimos, Se duermen. That's just, remember the reflexive part is weird because we don't really say that in English. You don't really say I put myself to sleep. The reflexive part just makes the action be reflected back to the subject. So that's an example of an O to UE verb. There's going to be a lot more verbs that change from O to UE. This just happens to be a few. You don't have to jot them down just yet because we're going to get a more complete list. Just know that jugar happens to be the weird one that's O to UE, that's included as part of all these other verbs that you'll see O's with. And so on all those O's, you're going to change. Notice here, you have an E and an O. Which one's closest to the A or E or IR? The O. So that's how you know you're going to change that one. O to UE, O to UE, O to UE. Same thing with recordar. You have an E and an O. You always know which one to change by it being closest to the end. Okay. So that's O to UE. I'm going to make the more complete list in a minute, but if you want to jot these down, just ask for these and I'll teach you how to. Okay, the second type or family of stem changing verbs is E to IE. Pensar is to think. And again, we're going to have to start knowing meanings for these as well. But in the present tense only, changes in the boot from E to IE. So, pienso, piensas, piensa, pensamos, piensan. So again, notice we're using present tense endings because we're only talking about these changes happening in the present tense. So what's the first kind of change? What do you E? What's the second kind? E to IE. What's another verb that's E to IE that we've already done in Spanish 1? Detener was one. Anybody remember the other one? Kind of already just went over it. Querer was the other one we did in Spanish 1. But again, there's more verbs that are going to be the same pattern, changing from E to IE. Now, every now and then you'll end up with two E's. Again, just change the one closest to the end. If you have an O and an E, you'll know to change the one closest to the end. Two E's closest to the end. Now, this doesn't count. The querer is what you're going to drop to add your endings. So that's not the E that you're going to make the stem change in, because that's not the stem part of the verb. Everybody okay with the stem being what you have after you drop the A or E or IR? Okay, so that doesn't count as the second E, because that won't be there. You're going to drop it to conjugate. Okay. Let me mention this here because some people are fresh from last chapter and they see these verbs, and what does this make you think of from last chapter?
CE.
Right, so ZAR verbs change to CE only in the yo form. Does that apply in present tense? Since we're talking about these in the present tense, preterite rules, cargarizar rules, do not apply to present tense. So you have to keep present tense separate from preterite tense. Different set of rules each time we switch tenses. Okay. All right, so ODUE. E to I, and our last one is E to I. Again, also talking about these in the present tense. Pedir. You'll notice in your vocab, a lot of your vocab is restaurant related, and so pedir is to ask. But since we're talking about restaurant related terms, to order, like you ask for something at a restaurant, you order something at a restaurant. So to ask or order. Okay. You're going to change the E to an I inside the boot shape, which just leaves nosotros out. And if you turn to page 40 in your textbook, page 40 gives you a couple more examples. Gives you pedir, servir, seguir, and vestirse. So if you want to look there for the different examples, all I want to mention with E to I verbs is that some of them will have an extra accent on the original form of the verb. We haven't really seen that before. So when you have the original accent with the infinitive form, infinitive, just a fancy term for not conjugated. So once you have that, what did I do with that? you will just end up putting extra accents on all the I's on every conjugation. Now normally we don't have to worry about accents in the present tense because the verb itself has an extra accent.
And we need to know these.
Sorry?
We need to know the meanings of these verbs.
Yes, you'll need to know the meanings of these verbs. Okay. What did I do with it? Alright. You'll see as we start practicing these that the ones that have the original accent, all the I's will carry accents for those. Again, if you have an O and an E, even if the E is the very last letter before you drop your ARE or IR to conjugate, you're still going to change that E to an I. If it happens to be reflexive and a stem changer, you do both things. Do your me, te, se, no, sin, se, and change your E to I in this case. Couple of things that I'm going to show you on the chart that you're about to get. The verb decir, very similar to how we did tener. Tener was tengo. It was an extra change in the yo form. So I call them shoe verbs because instead of going all the way up to the yo form in the boot, there's something extra you need to remember for the yo form. So for decir, which is to say or tell, digo is the yo form. You still change your E to I. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Like tener you do. Tener you don't change E to IE or anything on the yo form. It's just a go change. Decir you do. So when I show you your charts, you will have the difference between some verbs. I'll show you here on your charts. Some of these verbs are E to IE. Some will be E to I. Okay, you're about to get this in just a minute. Let me just go through the chart really quick so that you understand kind of what's on it. You have stem changing verbs in the present tense only. They're boot verbs, which means all the way up you're going to make a stem change. The shoe verbs I put at the bottom of each of these two sections because the yo form, sigo. The rest of the forms you're going to make an E to I change inside the little shoe. Everybody see the difference between a boot going all the way up and a shoe coming down one from the yo form? Okay. So the yo form is sigo, tener, tengo, venir, vengo. So notice that seguir and decir. See how this one works as a shoe? The yo form is irregular. This one happens to do the E to I change. These don't. So here is the tricky part about this chapter, and I'm about to hopefully make it less tricky for you. We are only going to be working with stem changing verbs. Okay? So it'll be helpful for you to know that everything will change. Unless it's in the nosotros form, it's going to change in some way, shape, or form. If the verb has an O in it, it's a given. What change is it going to make? O to UE. This is where we run into problems because we have a whole bunch of verbs that have E's on them. Now, if the verb happens to have an O and an E, but the E is the second one, you're still going to have to worry about it. Well, which change do I make? Is it an E to IE or an E to I?
E to I.
This is how I'm going to narrow it down for you instead of just saying, have fun memorizing. Okay? If the verb has an O, automatic, O to UE. What if it has an E and an O? Doesn't matter. If it's the O closest at the end, that's the change it's going to make. So this column is taken care of. You should know if you run into any of those verbs that have an O or an O closest at the end, you're going to make an O to UE change. This is how I want you to narrow it down. All your E to I verbs happen to end in IR. Yes? Even the shoe one that I moved down here. They all end in IR. So that helps you narrow that down. If you look at your middle column, the E to IE column, and you scan down, you only have one, divertirse, or divertir, 2, 3, 4, 5. So divertir, preferir, referir, sentir, and venir. those are 5 verbs that are IR verbs that end in IR. So you can either have fun memorizing the chart, or you can remember these 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If those 5 happen to show up, they're going to be E to I changes. What if you happen to have a verb that has an E in it that is an AR verb? What change will it make?
I.
Right. Because do you have any AR verbs over here? No. What if it happens to be an ER verb that happens to have an E on it?
I.
You can only make an I change. Does everybody see how to narrow down the chart, how to make it more easily accessible?
Are we gonna have this chart?
Yes, I'm about to give you the chart. Let me just mention this to you, that this part right here that I have covered up, I have it covered up for a reason, because we're going to talk about what happens with some of these verbs in the preterite. For now, ignore any of this. Ignore anything that's in orange on the chart. Anything that's in orange, we're going to come back and talk about what happens with those verbs in the preterite, past tense. For today, we're only talking about what happens with these verbs in the present tense. And all the verbs with the purple stars are the verbs that are going to be on your second quiz. So all the ones that are arrows on the back of your vocab sheet, they're all included on here if you want to mark them on this list. Questions so far? Alright, so what are our 3 types of changes? Okay, and it only happens in what tense? Only in the present tense. When we make these changes for some of these verbs in the preterite, they will not make ODUE changes or E to IE changes, and it won't be boot changes. You'll see when we cover those, they'll be called basement changes because they only change on the bottom. So for now, I want you to copy down these meanings, become familiar with the meanings. The quiz this week will just be over meanings of the vocab ones, not the extra ones. The quiz next week will be not only knowing the meanings, but also the conjugations. So making the stem change and making sure you have the right ending on it. So copy down these meanings. Everybody okay with how to tell the difference between ODUE, E to I, E to I? Copy those down. Then I want you to practice some on the back. Your back has it split from E to IE and E to I in 2 separate sections. Just know we're going to start out conjugating them and practicing the stem change in separate sections. But eventually, this whole entire chart is going to merge. And we're going to throw it up in the air, and it's going to land on your paper in any order. So you can see any of these verbs together as we work through them.